So my name is Meryl Ainsman. I'm from the steering committee of the summit. Welcome everyone to this session, A Community Responds, Not in Our Town. And I'd like to introduce our moderator, Bill Eisler, who is a friend and a colleague and just an all-around super smart guy. So, Bill, hand it over.
Thank you, Meryl. I am filling in for Deb Kaplan, who could not be here today. And we have one other panelist who has just pulled up in front of the building, Wasi, who will be here in a few minutes. But we want to begin with a short clip of a film. Jeff, thank you.
I didn't hear the shots the first time. I hear them all the time now. And I suspect I'm not alone. So many of us, whether Jewish or not, whether from Squirrel Hill or not, whether in Pittsburgh that morning or not, hear those shots still. They were the modern-day shots heard around the world. The opening shots in our contemporary crisis of hurt and hate.
Suspects talking about all these Jews need to die.
I become frustrated about what I can do as an elected leader in a city that has now witnessed the worst anti-Semitic attack in American history.
It's not just about anti-Semitism. It was an attack on America. Its foundation is hate.
White supremacy, white nationalism, and racism are national security threats.
The story of what's happened in Pittsburgh starts with some of the worst pain that you can imagine. And it ends with some of the best and closest relationships that I could have ever hoped for.
We will work together as one. We will defeat hate with love. We will be a city of compassion, welcoming to all people, no matter what your religion or where your family came from on this earth or your status.
Torah is referred to as a tree of life. It's the source of who we are as Jews. "11 beautiful lives were cut down in our synagogue. But we're a tree of life. More leaves will grow back. More branches will grow back. We're not letting hate close our doors, ever."
The trailer you've just seen is based from the film Repairing Our World by Patrice O'Neill, who is with us today, one of our panelists. It's a documentary that really talks about the story after the massacre at the Tree of Life in October of 2018. It presents a powerful tool of how communities can be resilient and get on with lives in a very positive way after hate has affected them in very powerful ways. Patrice's film clearly goes beyond the Pittsburgh community. She is the executive director of Not in Our Town and has done a number of documentaries dealing with the aftermath of hate. Today's panel, and we're very lucky that Patrice is here, also includes Ron Simons, who is the director of the Center for Love and Kindness and Civic Engagement at the Jewish Community Center of Pittsburgh. I'm thrilled to have him here. He is a friend and somebody that I'm lucky enough to work with. We also have next to Patrice, and I'm going to hold because I want Patrice to talk first. Faye, and she's helped me with the name, and I know I'm still going to blow it, but it's Antatola, right? Akintola. Thank you. I apologize, but I apologize before we ever got up here. Faye is with the mayor's office. She's the manager of immigration affairs for the city of Pittsburgh. Internationally, I want to welcome Michelle Ehman. Michelle is the co-founder of the Violence Prevention Network. She is from Germany, arrived Sunday night, and we're really glad to have her in Pittsburgh and have her as a member of the panel. And Wasi Muhammad, who is the senior policy advisor for the Pittsburgh Foundation, is going to join us when he gets in. But today we're going to talk about how we can prepare and prevent acts of hate.
We want acts of hope. Just in case you didn't know, we would like acts of hope.
This is the man that keeps me straight. I just want you to know, in more ways than one. We have a little standing gig between us.
Go ahead, you do it.
Then when I see him, I say, "My rabbi."
I say, "My Catholic."
And so that's how we greet each other when we see each other in the streets of Squirrel Hill. But we also want to talk about promoting positive change and how do you build a very resilient community that can work together to do what we want to do as part of this conference and a part of our daily lives. I'm going to ask the panelists, and we're going to begin with Patrice, to talk about how a community can work together to build an atmosphere of positive work and create a strong foundation against hate. And what innovative methods have you used or have seen or liked that can enhance our work? And I want to begin with Patrice, who is an incredible, incredible documentarian. I have seen a number of her clips in other sessions in this conference, and it's a joy to know you and a joy to have you do work that really tells a great story in Pittsburgh.
Well, thank you, and I just want to remind you all that Bill, for many years, ran the Fred Rogers organization, and I talked to him because we used some of the music from Fred Rogers opening and describing Squirrel Hill, and getting to know him is you just feel the kindness that is in this man and as a leader. So I'm really glad that you are here. We're missing Deb Kaplan, but I'm also really grateful that you're here. I'm going to take just a few minutes to tell you a little bit about Not in Our Town. Repairing the World is the latest documentary amongst 7 that we've done for public television about communities standing up against hate. And it started with the film we did. Many of you probably heard me speak about it at the plenary the other day, about people in Billings, Montana, ordinary people. As President Biden said, it is a story about what all of us can do to stand up to hate. It was a short, simple film about people standing up for their neighbors, and it aired on PBS in the year of the Oklahoma City bombing. There were hundreds of screenings of it across the country that were self-organized in local communities with public television, with local organizations. And people started identifying with the name Not in Our Town. And the name Not in Our Town came from a billboard. When people were being attacked in Billings, there was a billboard on a sporting goods store that said, "No hate, no fear, no violence, not in our town." And people said, okay, what does that mean to us? What does that mean to us? What's happening in our town that we need to pay attention to? So the movement really began when people in Bloomington, Illinois, saw black churches being burned across the South, and they said, we don't want that to happen in our town. We're marching from the courthouse to the local church to say we stand in solidarity with black churches in our town, and we went to film them and have been following the story ever since. And so when Pittsburgh happened, as journalist A.C. Thompson says in the film, we were shocked and horrified, but not surprised. Because as we travel around the country with these films, and I hope you get to meet my co-director now of Not in Our Town, Pardeep Kalika. We told the story of the attacks at the Sikh Temple of Wisconsin in 2012, 10 years ago now. Then it was the deadliest anti-hate attack in 50 years in the United States, and here we are now. And but Pardeep lost his dad at the temple. He now speaks with us, and we were traveling with that film, and we started hearing these horrible stories of young people experiencing anti-Semitism and this resurgence that we've all seen discussions about. So in the course of doing this film and getting to know people, we've started to put up best practices. What have we learned from communities about how they have effectively tried to prevent hate? And so we aggregate that knowledge, put it on the web, and then try to serve a network of communities around the country. And so let's just look at the slide. We're going to move to one slide. This is the slide of Billings. This is an example of them holding menorahs. Let's go to the next one. I want to alert you to something that we've learned over the years. This is really important to understand as we think about how we prepare for and respond to hate. This is something that becomes apparent if you work in communities standing up to hate. We go and we do a screening, and it creates an atmosphere of one of our films. It creates an atmosphere where people can feel safe to talk about what's happened to them, right? And that isn't always the case. There isn't always the opportunity to do that. I just saw it when we showed Repairing the World upstairs with nearly 100 high school students who came to see the film today. They immediately wanted to talk about what was happening to them and how they could use the film in discussions and what motivated them to want to speak up to their peers when this happened. This is really important because when you look at this, these statistics show that the vast majority of hate crimes are not reported. They are not in the official statistics. So, you know, on average, the FBI aggregates these hate crimes, and they estimate there are about 7,000. The Bureau of Justice Statistics estimates there are over 250,000. Like, why am I saying this in a story about solutions and what we're going to do in community? If we don't surface that, and if we don't create a way to understand the real harms that are happening in our community, we can't deal with this. We can't get to the perpetrators or people that we know around them, or create an atmosphere, which is the whole purpose. How do we create an atmosphere that inoculates us from hate? And that's what we have been trying to learn for these many years. What's successful? What works? So let me get to this next part. So recently, as the attacks just kept going on, let's go to the next slide. We started thinking about what are the towns that are really effective at preventing hate, that have been doing this for a long time? What do they have in common? And one of the things they have in common is they have these stakeholder groups where they can call on people when something happens, when they can communicate with each other, when they hear about incidents. And so we came up with this idea to try to pilot hate and bias action teams so that you have these key stakeholders in any community that are working together and communicating with each other and have their ears to the ground. Essential to this are communities who are most vulnerable and targeted by hate. They're at the top, you see them there, and there's only one little circle for that, but it is multiple communities. That's essential. And then the key leaders. And I can talk to you about what we've learned about these systems. I want to get on to the rest of the panel, but just to say that how can we take this film, Repairing the World, and do screenings, because we think that there is incredibly fertile ground here in Pittsburgh. You showed the world how to prepare. You showed the world how to respond. Now, can Pittsburgh show the world how to prevent? And I think that's what we're excited about thinking about doing here in Pittsburgh. Can we further this model as we roll this film out in the community? And we've only had a couple of screenings so far, but can we roll it out in neighborhoods, in diverse neighborhoods across the city, and start this discussion? So,
thank you. No, thank you. A lot there. Faye, before we begin with you, I just want to mention that there are QR codes on either side. If you want to ask any questions or any comments, please just go to the QR codes and we will pick up right here from the iPad. Faye, let's talk about your work on a daily basis. You've been in Atlanta, you've been in Pittsburgh. Talk to us about what you see in terms of hate, violence in the work that you do, and what do you do to help heal, to respond, and as Patrice said, hopefully prevent?
That's a really good question. Thank you for asking again. Such a pleasure to be with you all in person and the folks watching online. We're happy you're joining us as well. And in my work, I think it's quite complex, right? Like Dave mentioned, I work for the Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs, and we have the pleasure of working with refugee resettlement agencies, community leaders, to kind of build an understanding, build trust, and as a result, learn how we as government could partner with them to help create solutions. I think what I've seen is a couple of different things, right? So for one sense, a lot of our communities who are coming, especially if you're a refugee, right? You're coming because you're fleeing conflict, right? You've probably been in a refugee camp for a lot. Some of the kids are born there. They've been there for years. So what happens is when they come here and let's just say hate crime, like you mentioned, Patrice, to them, they weigh based on past experiences. I've been through so much worse than this, right? So it becomes very passive. Even though for others who have been here for a long time, we're just more quick to respond, or we might think or might share it with someone else. But for them, it's like, I want to start a family. I want to get a job. I want to get situated. I've been in refugee resettlement agency. So it becomes more of a passive stance. So now what you end up seeing is how refugee resettlement agencies have to start to educate refugees that when you encounter situations like this, that's not okay, right? Versus, other countries where we come from, where there are no formal laws, where there are no guidelines, and anything just kind of happen, and you find your own way as individuals or as a community to respond. It's now trying to teach that, fortunately, in the United States, there are rights, right? And we have to, I think it starts with educating our community about what are their rights, and they have every right to take advantage of that. And that's why I almost see my role as in the city of Pittsburgh. I think every time we have our Welcoming Communities meeting that Rabbi Ron is always a part of, every time we meet with community, I always tell people, I want people to know that this is your new home. And what that means is you could take advantage of it as you see fit. Go to the resources, go to events, rather than feel like I have to stay in my home, I have to stay in my neighborhood, I'm a stranger. I'll share one thing with you. Now, last Welcoming Pittsburgh call that happened a couple of weeks ago, we had a woman who owns a language access company kind of share with us that there was a survey that was shared from school. And it was for the parent to take the survey on behalf of the child, but the parent didn't speak English, but the child did. And the child responded to the survey, and it was questions asking about what are your aspirations, what do you want to do, so on and so forth. And the young girl answered, I feel like I am a second-class citizen, right? I feel like what I want to do in life is I want to work in Walmart because I don't have to speak English to anyone. I could just be by myself. Almost saying things of hopelessness to the point that the school had to follow up and come home, and the mom then realized, wait, something had occurred here that she wasn't aware of. And before you know it, people on the call started to talk about, oh, I know situations such as this as well. I know this. We're willing to help. And so that exists amongst us. And it would be easy if it came in a red clothing with horns and we could see it and we could call it out and say, like, hate looks like this, bias looks like this, but it doesn't. It looks just like every one of us day to day. So I think it's how do we start to incorporate education, letting people know within your workplace, within your faith-based organizations, everywhere where people could know that, one, your humanity matters. And I think I always try to see it whenever I work with different groups. everyone wants to fight for their dignity. Everyone wants to be seen and wants to be known. And I feel like even with white supremacy, what we're hearing is they think something is being taken away from them. And it's like, you have rights just like anybody else's. No one is better than the other. We're all equal, right? We all matter, right? So it's how can we let people know that you have dignity as a human being? And I think when we start to incorporate that, that matters. I will also say one for members of our Asian community. More recently, they've expressed interest in wanting to build relationships with our police. And only because what the data that you just shared, Patrice, and the fact that even though we're seeing anti-hate crimes, Asian anti-hate crimes going up, the reports of it are low, right? So, but they're seeing it in their own communities and saying like, well, what can we do? It starts with building trust. So fostering environments. We brought our assistant chief of police, we brought our Chinese Asian community together and saying like, we have to get to know one another. And so they're coming to community events with the Asian community. We're inviting the Asian community to go to community zone meetings so that authentic relationships can be built. So it's not about, oh, I have to call 911 and report. It's more like, I have to call a friend that I know and tell them what's going on. So I think those kind of things matter and make a difference. Thank you.
Faye, we're grateful that you're in Pittsburgh. We're glad you stayed after college.
Thank you.
You're wonderful. Michelle Lehman, as I mentioned, is from Germany and is a co-founder of the Violence Prevention Network. And we're really happy you're here and really want to hear about your work because you are planning on doing some work in Pittsburgh also, which is great. So thank you for coming.
Thank you, Bill. And yeah, thank you everyone for joining this session, also online. And first off, it's been just such an amazing experience to start to get to know some community organizations, some community leaders in Pittsburgh, and the welcome and the commitment to doing something about hate and to prevention has just astounded me. So I am very humbled to hope that we can bring a tiny little piece of the prevention puzzle as well. And first, I'd love to tell you just what our work looks like in Germany and then just a bit of what we have planned for Pittsburgh.
Great.
So we've existed for about 20 years in Germany. And it's really interesting, actually, how many connections there are between what you were describing and our work in Germany, even though you're sort of describing your work with people who experience hate crimes, perhaps with victims, if you want to use that term, and we work with perpetrators. Hi.
So sorry.
No, so glad you're here. So glad you're here. And our over the past, our work started out in prisons, working with individuals who are incarcerated for committing ideologically motivated violent crime. And really working with them to see if they can start loosening the grip of the ideology and the hate and start embracing more pluralistic and democratic ways of thinking and acting. And that's a long process that doesn't happen overnight. But we have seen quite a few successes. Over the years, we've worked with close to 2,000 well-documented cases. And there have been some studies that have shown sort of generally the recidivism rates in Germany for those types of violent offenders are about 41%. And individuals who've participated in our program, we've been able to bring that rate down to about 13%. So, and our work sort of expanded from there, also outside of the sort of context of incarceration, because, and this mirrors very much what you were saying, Faye, oftentimes there's maybe friends or family members, social workers or teachers that notice that something is wrong with an individual that they encounter in a personal or professional context, but they are not willing to call the police on them. And there needs to be someone for them to talk to sort of help, look at the signs, assess the risk, plan next steps so that this person doesn't lose contact. And so that's a big part of our work in Germany as well, sort of a national hotline that is available for people to call and sort of plan what needs to happen next based on sort of the level of commitment to hate and violence. And so in Pittsburgh, we're hoping, this is something that's worked in Germany. U.S. context is very different, but we're planning a small pilot where we're hoping to build connections with so many of the great organizations and individuals doing work, and build out a referral network where we would offer workshops and training to sort of recognize early signs and make available contact. And we're also hoping to bring together a small but powerful group, a small cohort team of community leaders to go through more extensive training of how to work with individuals at risk of radicalizing or potentially already sort of radicalized to violence, to sort of help them let go of hate and violence.
Thank you. We're glad you're here. And
thank you, Bill.
Both for this conference, but also for the long term. It's great.
Thank you.
Rabbi Ron?
Well, thank you, everyone, and I'm really grateful to be here with everyone. And I am aware that everything that we have heard and will hear about not in our town, we're not going to have hate in our town, about how is it that we make Pittsburgh more welcoming for everyone, about how is it that we can spread the idea that we're going to prevent violence before it starts with a hotline, that how is it that the foundations can be a part of that process. Every single aspect of that I relate to in two ways. One is as a community organizer, I know that the world as it is today is not the way that I want it to be tomorrow. And that's why we do our work together. And the second is, as a person of faith, that I know that the world as it is today is not the way that we want it to be tomorrow. And in faith terms, that's usually called Messiah. That's usually called that we're dreaming of a world yet to be. So the Center for Loving Kindness and Civic Engagement was founded back in August of 2017, because all throughout 2016 and 2017, we realized that the conversation that was going on across America and the way that it was infiltrating even the interactions that we were having with each other was not the right kind of conversation. It wasn't about who won, it was about how the conversation was being had. And so we realized that at the Jewish Community Center that we needed, with the help of thought partners and foundation partners, we needed to take the messages that we knew were most central to what it means to live in resilient community and broadcast them in a new way for 21st century. Mm-hmm. And so that's why we established the Center for Loving Kindness, in order to strengthen the fabric of community by amplifying the long-held values of love your neighbor as yourself and do not stand idle while your neighbor bleeds, so that we can redefine the word neighbor from a geographic term to a moral concept. We do that so that we can have neighbors come together based on their humanity, as Faye described, in such a way that we realize that we are all connected to each other, even though we have real and perceived differences. And so everything that we're involved in our own sectors that interconnect, is all a part of the same dream that what we got today is not good enough for what we want for tomorrow. And in our case, through the Center for Loving Kindness, and I'll tell you, I mean, I don't know what the right word is, whether it's grateful or appreciative or I don't know what. But the fact that we started in 2017 and our shooting didn't happen until 2018, I just feel like we were in the right place at the right time for all the wrong reasons. But this is who we are, and this is what we have to do. And so I'm going to keep on dreaming long distance, not just tomorrow, but the day after, and the day after, and the month after, and the year after, and the decade after, etc. And I'm going to keep on dreaming that we're going to have a community where organizations and individuals are actually going to live up to that idea that neighbor is a moral concept and not just a geographic term. We're going to keep on dreaming and working towards the idea that people, neighbors, will become upstanders, not bystanders. We won't just sit back and watch what's going on and say, well, that's their problem. But we're going to, like the people of Billings, right, we're going to pick up a menorah because when a 6-year-old has a brick thrown through his window because he had a paper menorah, on his window, or it was a real menorah at that time, and the newspaper prints 10,000 paper menorahs that get plastered across Billings, Montana, where I don't know how many Jews there were, but there weren't 10,000. Maybe there were 50, right? 100, 150? I don't know. It's amazing. Yeah. And it's not just because of about anti-Semitism. It should happen with any issue. We're going to keep on dreaming because we want people to look at the world around us and what's going on from a values-based perspective. And often in my line of work, people talk about Jewish values. And I keep on reminding people that values are human. They're human. And we have Jewish lenses that we use to look at them. And so that we all can be working on that together, even through our differences. We also, of course, dream that religion is not going to be a separator, but it's going to be a connector, that we can work across lines of difference in religion. We also have this dream that law enforcement and clergy, spiritual leaders, will figure out once and for all, on an ongoing basis, that we've got to do the work together in order to build resilient community. Because when it goes bad, boy, does it go bad. And both law enforcement and spiritual leaders have the ability to make it a little bit better. And in a very contemporaneous way, we are really concerned that people will only hang out with their own partisan comrades. That if you voted for that person, well, I'm never going to talk to you. And I'm only going to hang out with my folks. And like we heard earlier this morning, that we can have an FBI agent who's a Southern Republican who likes Jack Daniels, telling his story through a journalist who's a liberal Canadian who, likes Jack Daniels, right? That if we can do that more and get away from the partisan politics, that's the world yet to be. That's the dream of being a community organizer. And that's the dream of what for thousands of years, people of faith have said, it's going to get better. But we got to do the work in order for it to get better.
Yes, excuse me. Patrice wants 1 second, Wasi, before you begin.
Well, Wasi, Rabbi Ron was saying he wanted you to speak as a philanthropist, but I got to know you as a young organizer and head of the Islamic Center, and as a person who is so committed to connections, which our story, Repairing the World, is all about. How do we build those connections in community and build those relationships? So I hope that you can wear two hats maybe in this conversation, but that's the hat that I hope you put on first, maybe.
If you ever want to know what a producer does, you have just seen it.
Right, live on stage.
It is taking over and doing it.
Good luck.
We're friendly, we can say that. But what I want to say about Wasi is he is ever present. There is never an incident in this community where he has not stepped forward. And we're fortunate, and I want to say this from a philanthropic point of view, we're fortunate that the Community Foundation has him as their senior policy officer, because he certainly knows his community. He is not a native of Pittsburgh. He grew up in the central part of the state, but he has learned very, very quickly how Pittsburgh works, who can help, and who will help. Thanks, Wasi.
Oh, thank you so much. That's way too kind, but I appreciate it. I love Pittsburgh. It's done a lot more for me than I've done for it, but love to call it home now. And I'll do my best to wear both hats, and I'll start with the one that you mentioned. First and foremost, I apologize to everybody for being late today in the middle of a bit of a family health emergency. So as you know, those go, you never know, when you get caught up a little bit. So, but first and foremost, I think a lot of what Rabbi Ron was saying is exactly the kind of things I think the Islamic Center and the Muslim community in my time organizing, we believe in those principles, and we're trying to build people together in a similar way. So not to be repetitive, I think one thing, I think the question was about, let me speak to kind of unifying the region, right, and unifying communities that are been apart, and the divisiveness, particularly politically, right? I think we're not that far away from another midterm election. We're not that far, a couple of years away from another presidential, which the Muslim community always dreads because it's when anti-Muslim attacks kind of spike. And, I think a lot of our rhetoric is generally driven by it. And I think that one thing we've really tried to do is how do we take the parts of our being, right, that social media and other things are allowing to come out a little bit more, that we can be more negative, we can be more hurtful with our words and less thoughtful with our words, and we didn't know what to do. I think gathering is something that I want to kind of lift up, because I'm thinking a lot because we're all here, right? It's really nice because this thing could have been virtual. All of us didn't have to come together physically. We all probably have been on a Zoom meeting or two in the last couple of years, So I think that there's something about togetherness, to come together regularly as community, to be active, to be present with each other, to join each other's communities, which is something we try a lot to do in Pittsburgh, to not stay within our bubble, which it's hard enough to do. You got to make time for your own community, your own family, your own, extended folks, your own religious community, right? But to make time and be sure to be in community with everybody else, I think that's just made a huge difference. To open up, the first thing I wanted to talk about was just physically gathering and coming together is really important and powerful. And I think that, and when I think of the most motivating moments in the last couple of years, right, in which a majority of my time has been spent virtually. Right, my job was remote, like many went, we were not gathering, right? But if I think of what moments had impacted me so much so in those years, regardless of there being way less opportunities for in-person contact, it was definitely in-person opportunities. Being with somebody, talking about something in a group. So I don't know how we kind of keep that up. I wanted to, hopefully talk about that a little bit more. But I think realizing, since 2018 to now, how important coming together has always been, seeing that we moved away from it for the last couple of years for important reasons, that for health reasons we weren't together as much. How do we return? How do we come back? And as community organizers, on the stage, I think we would understand how difficult it was to organize with people so separate, right? It was really hard. It took away certain momentum, from certain initiatives. And to get back to it, I think that we need to remind people the benefits of coming together. And it's a lot of it's intangible, but it's extremely important. So we've been doing our best in the Muslim community to be togetherness is in solidarity in word and practice, I think is important. And they do that right now. But if you haven't shown up and haven't been present with other community members in a couple of years, you got to do it, right? You got to show up. You got to physically be there. You got to go visit another center, go worship with somebody else, go, have a meal, break bread, do something, So I think the loss of that is really tough, and I hope we all realize that in the last couple of years. And I just wanted to kind of bring together, it may not have been the exact right thing to bring up first, but it's just the number one thing that I've been thinking about, especially going through a personal family crisis, right? Just when family appeared and we were all together at the same time, it just makes all the difference. We were constantly in contact, text messages, cell phones, FaceTime, and it's not the same. It just really isn't the same. So I think getting a hug, from my brother is very different than talking to him and being together in a crisis. Right, we're completely on the same page. We're trying to get through everything together. But it's there's a little added element there I just want to highlight. So it's just on top of my mind. So I'm bringing that up first, and I'll definitely circle back and talk about a little bit more of the systemic and structural things. And I'd love to talk about philanthropy, but I'll bring it up in a different question. So yeah, go ahead.
Since you raised and I think it's really a good discussion point right now. Since you talked about a challenge and an obstacle, what are some of the challenges? I mean, we have 3 people who are working here in Pittsburgh, one from Germany who is going to be working in Pittsburgh, and somebody who's told a great story about Pittsburgh. What are the challenges and the obstacles to get the community to work together on this topic of this conference, Eradicate Hate?
Yeah.
I throw that out there.
I can start with philanthropy.
Please, go ahead.
So it's Pittsburgh Foundation, because naturally I came in, from this community, right? We've been working on these issues for years. We've been working on coming together years. Seeing a funder operate from the inside was really interesting, right? How do you prioritize what you resource, right? Where do you put your money? How do you end up making those decisions? This is definitely a more complicated space. I think in Pittsburgh we're passionate, and in response to the massive community surge and people demanding that we resource and fund this, right? But one of the difficulties is always going to be typical kind of nonprofit things like evaluation, right? The scarcity of the resources, how do you delegate them, right? Which programs, when you're comparing two things that are both anti-hate, which ones get resources and which ones don't? It's tremendously complicated. You know, I think that in philanthropy, not everybody has the background of being in the work for a very long time and understanding the nuances between the different efforts, what the cutting edge and leadership believes, the people that are like kind of in this work every single day, what's the direction, what's the most impactful kinds of programs that exist. I do think that in order to overcome a lot of these obstacles, we know we need resources, we need capacity, right? In order to achieve that, whether it's through private or government funding, which a lot of the programs and solutions being talked to throughout, some were government-funded solutions that are related to the community violence and violence response networks, and and other things. Other ones are private community nonprofit responses that people and places of worship and other people need to respond to. To have all of that in a complicated structure, I think we need to clarify our vision to get the resources we need, and then communicate that to funders. So one of the things I've spent the most time doing is that education within the institution and other institutions we work with, which I think that as a group, if we are more successful in clarifying, so not to name a specific challenge, but just but one challenge that underlies a lot of them is to communicate to those who have the resources what are the best ways to do it, because now sitting in the realms of funders, you just get hundreds of proposals, right? You have to do your best to sift through it, but if we're granted more education and more information, it's easier for us to weigh proposals and understand, well, research points to, or this really worked this other place, and then we can make more informed decisions about where to spend our resources. And the more we're on the same page and collaborating, the less overlap, the more synergy, the more that we can compile and combine our existing resources and to collectively go after more. If we really need a hotline, if we really need case management, if we really need counselors, whatever it is, but we all know that, but only one person goes and asks, I think it's way less powerful than if we all do, and we all make sure that those resources are available. We all make sure that those hotlines are funded. I think that's a big, challenge.
So I'll add to that I think that we need conveners. Right? If the city did not have an Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs, there would be a community of 50 people that are connected to immigrant and refugee organizations that will have no way to come together. We also need for our community organizations, the leadership in those organizations, to look at their role as one of trying to help community to thrive rather than just to survive. Because if you're just thinking that, how do I get through this day? How do I make sure I have enough people sitting in the seats, whatever your seats are? How do I make sure I have enough money, enough membership, whatever it might be? You're not going to have that larger vision of collaboration. And so I think it's those two that I would say are the biggest challenges that we have.
I'd pick up the challenge that both of you mentioned, actually, about polarization. And I think it's especially the responsibility of, it takes all of us to heal, but I think it's the responsibility of white people and white people who are not part of targeted communities to maintain connection. So when we hear neighbors in the broader sense make comments that make my stomach turn, make me highly uncomfortable, I think it's a response to sort of push away or say, I'm going to not avoid a conversation with this person. And I think what we need for the communities is to actually have the opposite response, to say, oh, this person is actually someone I need to stay in touch with, I need to stay in conversation with, so that isolation doesn't allow a certain kind of hate or ideology to grow. And I hope that with Violence Prevention Network we can kind of provide a little bit of the coaching, because that is not an easy thing to do.
My response would be accountability. Something about the movie that just really stuck with me was, I can't remember who said in the movie and saying like how the negative verbiage spreads is when someone says something in the room and no one responds back. It gives people permission to keep going. I think I could think of, to be honest, it makes me remember years ago when I was in Atlanta going to work, and I remember being on the train and I witnessed, this were Black Americans, so I witnessed a man call this other woman out of her name, and it was a back and forth, and she had her child, and we all said nothing. And we watched it happen because we were afraid, and it haunts me till today. So when I saw that in the movie, I thought, wow, like, how can I be more proactive? And because there's a lot of misinformation. Misinformation spreads quicker than the truth, right? But if we could be accountable as individuals, as people, to saying, hey, like, I heard you say that it's not called illegal, it's called undocumented. No one is illegal. You know, like, how can we be accountable to each other, and white, black, whatever we are, just be each other's neighbors, right? And saying, like, that's not the right way to present. And we don't say, you know, as in a form of we're judging and we're righteous, but more so as a neighbor to neighbor. I think you would do better if you had said it this particular way. But being accountable to each other, I think, is a way of us helping our population and addressing hate.
Patrice, let me just ask you to take a larger view of this based on your years of work in so many communities, what you've just heard, and how it resonates, and how you see communities overcoming some of these challenges and or obstacles.
I've seen what every single one of them say
Brilliant.
Play out
Yep.
in community after community after community. We need convening points. We need to make space to be together across differences and get people in the room. It's one of the reasons we do films, right? How can we get, and you know, a lot of times people come because somebody calls us and says, we see the signs of hate in our town and we want to do something. And so we say, okay, have you talked to these key people in your community? And we do the circle. It's like, have you called up the police chief? And you know, sometimes there's incredible distrust. It's like, okay, so let's ease into it. Let's think about who might be the connector, because they are responsible for the safety of a community, right? So, or have you called the school superintendent or a teacher or how do you get, and then if you are not, so, you know, if it's a black mom who calls, it's like, have you talked to the Jewish community? Have you talked to the Muslim community? And like, are the Latino community? Can you know, who are the connectors and how do you get people in the room? And sometimes what happens is the mayors, sometimes the city council calls, and we do this thing called United Against Hate Week that is convened by cities, right? But it is an opportunity, and the political leaders who not necessarily are in the room except for election time, they come to the room, they get to hear. So people are in the room, and we've seen studies, and there's amazing work by Betsy Pollock that talks about social norms change. How do we change social norms? And that films can play an incredible role in that, because people are in the room together, sort of witnessing what's okay, what's not, right? And so when you hear, like I just heard today, when those young people were in the room talking about, you know, this is what happens to me. There was an opening point for them to be able to speak about it. Because when you go into a classroom and say, hey kids, you want to talk about racism? It's like without context, without, you know, teaching like the incredible curriculums that are available from so many groups here and groups we work with like Facing History. Without that context and without that narrative that opens it, I think it's very hard. But when you have that and when you have those connections, you can really start to see change. And people are inspired and motivated to take the next step. And that's what, you know, I think you are so primed to do in so many ways here in Pittsburgh.
Bill, can I anticipate
Please,
a
go
question?
ahead. No.
So I'm imagining that some folks that are listening to this are saying, well, of course you're all saying this. Look at who we're hanging out with. We came to a conference to eradicate hate, right? And in some of our worlds, we call that preaching to the choir. But I want to be clear. It's not preaching to the choir. It's rehearsing with the choir. So that a person who sings with us in this wonderful song of harmony is able then to call out someone. Because, wait a second, there's a challenge here and I don't want you going down that road. Or to not be haunted by a moment, and we've all had those moments, where we just didn't stand up and do what we needed to do, so that next time, maybe we'll be a little bit more courageous, a little bit more out there, right? Not in a moral sense, but in a neighbor sense, not a overly self-righteous sense, but in a moral neighbor sense. And so I just want to be clear that this is not just that we're all in here together and, it's okay, it's our talk. We got to train people to do this on their own. And the more that we practice, the more that we rehearse, the better it's going to be out there in the big city.
Anybody else want to comment?
Rabbi Ron has a way with words. There's nothing he can say.
It's very kind of you.
Whoever wants to follow up.
Can I just talk about the obstacles too? Because I think everybody's named them, and Wasi has named them too. It's like, I think when you're in pain, sometimes it's really hard to think about moving out of your own pain, and opportunities for us to see each other in that way and to create a safe space where we can talk about that and share that. It's really hard, right? It's really, really hard. But acknowledging that and creating a space where that is possible. And I do think that if there's not uncomfortable conversations as we do this work, then the work is useless, right? If it is not difficult, if it is not uncomfortable, if it's not there's anger. There is so much anger. There's so much fear, right? But we have to get that out. It is part of the process. And if we don't know that and walk into the world with that knowledge and that understanding, then we're not prepared. And we see this as an obstacle and then we stop, right? So, but we can't. We get through that and we get through it and we get through it and we get through it. And those are the communities that I've seen most successful. 20 plus years doing this, going through we're just never going to get through this, and then they keep going, right?
Yeah, not to be Pollyannish about it, I do think that there are more people who want to help than, sometimes it's just the ask. I mean, I just point out one thing from the Center for Love and Kindness. There's a discussion about the election, and Ron said, we're nonpartisan, we're a 501c3 nonprofit, we can't comment on candidates. However, you can do things on your own, and one of the things you can do is be a poll watcher. What was the response?
Well, it's not to be a poll watcher because that's partisan.
I'm sorry.
It's to be a poll worker, right? And that's not partisan. And within 12 hours, we had 15 people fill out the application for it.
So sometimes it's just the ask that has to be made. And one of the things I mentioned yesterday morning, and I want to bring this up because we're coming to a close, is that the conveners of the conference, one of the intentions of this particular panel was to come out with something at the end. They talked about a toolkit or something that could help communities. And I think that you've seen up here sitting with these 5 people who are very, very passionate, both within Pittsburgh, within the country, and within the world. So the idea is, how can we take what we know? How can we take things in Pittsburgh that have part of this film? I mean, the Holocaust Center, Classrooms Without Border, the Light Initiative, the Healing Partnership. How can we take all these wonderful people who have been doing great work and put something together that, like the film, will help people to gather, to convene, and to do something? So I don't know if any of you want any parting words, but now is your chance.
You got a question coming your way.
Oh, I'm sorry. How does the city of Pittsburgh and the Pittsburgh Foundation focus in prevention? And we can't just side with the satisfaction of events that have problems. How does the city and the foundation, how do you plan on working on some of these issues that we discussed today?
Yeah. I was actually very hopeful that this convening itself and gathering everybody who came and all the experts and the deliverables, as you mentioned, that a lot of these are hoping to end with, would be very helpful in helping to direct philanthropy and their resources. I do think there needs to be more clear communication to help them better focus and what to resource. There's so many different kinds of initiatives, that are out there right now. I think that to best get philanthropy to come together, educational sessions, what did we learn, right? If we wanted to do this, right, I definitely can coordinate this meeting, right? Like what did we learn from this conference in the last 2 years, and what was submitted and what we've went over in all these amazing panels, is distilled and given in a presentation to all the major funders locally to kind of help them guide their vision, and city officials. We can do local government, city, county level, and federal. All allies, right? Those are all people we know, those are all people we can rely on. I think that we could definitely make that meeting happen. We just need to make sure we get the content. That's our job, I think they'll listen, and I think they'll react differently once they know it. I do think there's a missing step there where I do not feel, in my experience working with a lot of the folks, that they're well-versed enough on a lot of these, like the technical aspects, right? They're absolutely committed to the cause, but what specifically to fund a resource and who's responsible, who needs to take ownership and accountability of which part, that is still needs some clarity. And I feel like we have a lot of willing partners, and we're developing expertise through meetings like this. Next step is, right after this, we need to start writing and start figuring out what are we going to communicate to all those important regional players after this to get them to move towards action. And then we convene again in a year and figure out how do we do that even better, the next year. Here's what we learned after pushing them to action. So that's my first thought, to get those regional powers to start doing a little bit more. Yeah.
And I'll answer knowing that I'm not probably the right person to answer that in terms of working in public safety. But I think what I love about this administration is we're data driven. Everything is, what is the data showing? What are the trends showing? How do we kind of move in that direction? And I know that previous conversations, what we're seeing is more so gun violence that is going up, right? So we have strategic teams that focus on trends, particularly in some neighborhoods, and saying, okay, well, who are the community leaders there? We have a GVI team, we have folks in public safety who meet on a regular basis to say, what can we do? But I think what's really awesome that our mayor always says, in terms of, I think when I first started local government, I had so much aspirations of what local government was, but it wasn't until I was in it that I realized that it wasn't the answer. And I say that to say that there's so many things that we think local government's job to do this, versus no, we all play a role in this as well, right? So data is driven by people who report those information. So there's also a role that we as community play in that too. But again, we're data driven. There are particular folks in public safety and community that come together to kind of help address those trends.
Great. Again, I want to reiterate, if there's anybody in this audience that wants to work on this, has any interest in this, please get a hold of us. These three people were very, very easy to find. Especially, I can say, Ron and Faye, I mean, you can't get away. Wasi, I want to protect you a little bit because of the role you have in the philanthropy. It is a lot when you start talking about the proposals.
Did you bring your checkbook?
Yeah.
Because that's the thing, man.
But Michelle, thank you for joining us. I mean, we look forward to working with you. It's going to be fun to have you here. Patrice, thank you for telling our story and continuing to tell our story and continuing to reinforce what is great about this community, and especially the people working together, because it says a lot. And if anybody has not seen the film, it is being shown multiple times. Please see it. Thank you all, and thank to our panel, because they did a great job.
Thank you, Bill.
It's showing again at 4:30. So if you want to see it again, it'll be at 4:30, room 406.
And thanks to Deb Kaplan. I didn't do as good a job as she could have done, believe me, but she really did a great job of pulling this together.
Well, thank
So
you,
thank
Bill.
you, Deb.
You did great, Bill.
You did great.
Well, too kind.